Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. This is something you guys have been requesting for ages, and let me tell you, it took forever to find 3 stories that genuinely made my skin crawl. We're talking about the subway system, those underground tunnels where millions of people travel every single day, packed like sardines in metal tubes hurtling through the darkness. Most of the time, it's just another boring commute, but sometimes something happens down there that'll stick with you for the rest of your life. I've got 3 stories for you today that all took place in different subway systems around the world. Each one is more disturbing than the last, and I guarantee by the end of this video, you'll think twice before taking that late-night train ride alone. These aren't urban legends or creepypastas. These are real experiences from real people who lived through absolute nightmares in the depths of the underground. The first story comes from a college student in New York City. The second involves a night shift worker in London who encountered something that still haunts him to this day. And the third story, well, let's just say it involves the Tokyo subway system, and an experience so terrifying that the person who lived through it moved cities afterward. Before we dive in, I want you to picture yourself on your daily commute. The familiar rumble of the train, the flickering lights, the echo of footsteps on concrete platforms. Now imagine if that routine journey suddenly turned into your worst nightmare. That's exactly what happened to these 3 people, and their stories will make you realize that sometimes the most ordinary places can become the setting for extraordinary terror. So let's start with story number 1. This happened to a 19-year-old named Marcus who was attending New York University back in the fall semester. Marcus lived in Brooklyn and had to take the subway into Manhattan every day for classes. He was one of those students who always stayed late at the library, cramming for exams and working on projects until the building practically kicked him out. It was a Tuesday night in October, around 11:30, when Marcus finally packed up his stuff and headed for the subway station. The campus was pretty much deserted by then, and the streets had that eerie quiet that only comes late at night in the city. He made his way down into the Union Square station, swiping his Metro card and walking toward the platform for the N train that would take him back to Brooklyn. The platform was mostly empty except for a few other late-night commuters scattered around. Marcus pulled out his phone and started scrolling through social media while he waited for his train. That's when he first noticed the man standing about 20 feet away from him, closer to the edge of the platform. The guy looked to be in his 40s, wearing a long dark coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. But what really caught Marcus's attention was the way the man was staring. Not at his phone, not at the tracks, but directly at Marcus. When their eyes met, the man didn't look away. He just kept staring with this blank, emotionless expression that made Marcus feel incredibly uncomfortable. Marcus tried to ignore it, figuring the guy was probably just zoned out, or maybe dealing with some kind of mental health issue. The city was full of people who acted strange, and Marcus had learned to just mind his own business. But as the minutes ticked by, the man never stopped staring. Even when Marcus moved to a different spot on the platform, the man's head turned to follow him. When the train finally arrived, Marcus felt a wave of relief. He stepped into the car and found a seat near the middle, hoping to put some distance between himself and the creepy staring guy. But as the doors closed and the train pulled away from the station, Marcus glanced up and felt his stomach drop. The man in the dark coat was sitting directly across from him, still staring with that same unsettling intensity. The train car was nearly empty, just Marcus, the strange man, and maybe 3 or 4 other passengers spread throughout the car. Marcus tried to focus on his phone, but he could feel those eyes boring into him. Every time he looked up, the man was still there, still staring, never blinking, never changing his expression. At the next stop, a couple of people got off, making the car even more isolated. Marcus started to panic. He considered getting off at the next station, but that would mean waiting for another train and potentially being alone on an empty platform with this guy. So he stayed put, hoping the man would get off before his stop. But as they approached each station, the man never moved. He just sat there, locked onto Marcus like a predator watching its prey. Marcus noticed that the man's hands were perfectly still on his knees, and he never seemed to blink. It was like staring at a mannequin, except this mannequin was very much alive and very much focused on him. By the time they reached Marcus's neighborhood in Brooklyn, his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the noise of the train. The doors opened and Marcus quickly stood up and stepped onto the platform, hoping the nightmare was finally over. But as he walked toward the exit, he heard footsteps behind him, the distinct sound of someone following at the exact same pace. Marcus didn't want to look back, but he couldn't help himself. The man in the dark coat was there, about 10 feet behind him, still with that blank stare, still following. Marcus picked up his pace, and so did the man. When Marcus broke into a jog, the man matched his speed perfectly. The subway station exit led up a long staircase to street level. Marcus took the steps 2 at a time, his backpack bouncing against his spine as he climbed. The footsteps behind him echoed in the stairwell, maintaining that same eerie rhythm. When Marcus reached the street, he immediately turned left toward his apartment, hoping he could lose the guy in the maze of Brooklyn's side streets. But the footsteps continued behind him, never getting closer, never falling back, just maintaining that perfect distance. Marcus turned down a side street, then another, then doubled back toward a more populated area. Each time the man followed like a shadow that wouldn't disappear. Finally, Marcus spotted a 24-hour bodega that was still open. He rushed inside, the little bell above the door jingling as he entered. The store clerk looked up from his magazine and nodded. Marcus pretended to browse the snack aisle while keeping one eye on the window, watching the street outside. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Marcus saw him, the man in the dark coat standing directly outside the store window staring in. The fluorescent lights from inside the bodega illuminated his face, and Marcus could see his features clearly for the first time. The man had pale, almost gray skin, deep-set eyes that seemed too dark for his face, and thin lips that never moved or changed expression. Marcus grabbed a candy bar and approached the counter, trying to act casual while his hand shook. He paid for his purchase and asked the clerk if there was a back exit. The clerk looked confused but pointed toward a door behind the counter that led to an alley. Marcus thanked him and headed for the back door, but just as he reached for the handle, he heard the front door's bell jingle. The man had entered the store. Marcus didn't wait to see what would happen next. He pushed through the back door and found himself in a narrow alley that connected to the next street over. He ran through the alley and emerged onto a different block, then immediately called an Uber. While he waited for his ride, he kept scanning the area, expecting to see that dark coat and those hollow eyes appear around every corner. But the man was nowhere to be seen. The Uber arrived within minutes, and Marcus jumped in, giving the driver his address. As they drove through the quiet Brooklyn streets, Marcus finally started to relax. Maybe the guy had given up. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, and the man hadn't actually been following him. But as they turned onto Marcus's street, his blood ran cold. Standing under a streetlight directly in front of his apartment building was the man in the dark coat, waiting, still staring in that same emotionless way. Marcus told the Uber driver to keep driving, his voice barely a whisper. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, probably thinking his passenger was having second thoughts about the address. But Marcus couldn't get out of that car, not with that thing waiting for him under the streetlight. They drove around the block 3 times while Marcus tried to figure out what to do. He considered calling the police, but what would he tell them? That a man had looked at him on the subway and followed him home. They'd think he was paranoid or making it up. The man hadn't actually done anything illegal. He'd just been incredibly, impossibly persistent. Finally, Marcus asked the driver to drop him off 2 blocks away. He paid the fare and stepped out onto the sidewalk, immediately ducking behind a parked car. From his hiding spot, he could see his apartment building in the distance. The streetlight was still on, casting its yellow glow on the empty sidewalk. The man was gone. Marcus waited another 10 minutes before making his move. He crept along the sidewalks, staying in the shadows, checking every doorway and alley for any sign of the dark coat. When he reached his building, he fumbled with his keys, his hand shaking so badly he could barely get the right one into the lock. He made it inside and up to his third-floor apartment without incident. Once he was safely behind his locked door, Marcus collapsed onto his couch, his heart still racing. He grabbed his laptop and started researching, typing in search terms like subway stalker New York and man in dark coat following people. But nothing came up that matched his experience. Over the next few days, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of those hollow eyes. He started taking different subway lines to get to campus, even though it meant longer commute times. He avoided the Union Square station completely, but no matter which route he took, he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, scanning every face in every crowd. 3 weeks later, Marcus was running late for a midterm exam. Without thinking, he rushed down into the Union Square station and jumped on the first N train that arrived. It wasn't until the doors closed that he realized his mistake, and it wasn't until the train pulled away from the platform that he saw him again. The man in the dark coat was sitting in the exact same spot as before, wearing the exact same clothes, with that exact same blank stare fixed directly on Marcus. It was as if no time had passed at all, as if the man had been sitting there for 3 weeks straight waiting for Marcus to return. This time, Marcus didn't wait. At the very next stop, he bolted from the train, pushing past other passengers to get to the doors before they closed. He heard footsteps behind him, but he didn't look back. He ran up the station stairs and straight into the first building he could find, a busy department store. Marcus spent the entire day hiding in that store, moving from floor to floor, pretending to shop while keeping watch for any sign of the dark coat. When evening came, he called his roommate to pick him up. He never took the subway alone again. But here's the thing that still haunts Marcus to this day. He did some research on that particular subway car after the second encounter. He found out that 3 months before his first experience, a man matching the exact description had been found dead on the tracks at Union Square Station. The man had been wearing a long dark coat, and according to the police report, he'd been dead for at least a week before anyone discovered the body. The coroner ruled it a suicide, but here's what really messed with Marcus's head. The timestamp on the security footage showed the man had died on the same day of the week, at the same time of night, that Marcus first encountered him on the platform. Marcus never found out who the man was or why he'd chosen to follow him. But sometimes late at night when he's lying in bed, Marcus wonders if the man is still down there in the tunnels, still waiting on that platform, still looking for someone else to follow home. Our second story takes place across the ocean in London, involving a man named David who worked the night shift at a 24-hour printing facility in East London. David had been taking the tube home at ungodly hours for almost 2 years, so he thought he'd seen everything the London Underground had to offer. Drunk football fans, people sleeping rough, the occasional fight breaking out between strangers. But nothing could have prepared him for what happened on a foggy Thursday morning in November. David's shift ended at 4 in the morning, and he made his usual trek to the Mile End station to catch the Central line home. The platform was completely deserted, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. What was unusual was the temperature. Even though it was November in London, the platform felt like a freezer. David could see his breath forming clouds in the air, and the metal benches were covered in a thin layer of frost. He figured there was probably some kind of ventilation problem, maybe cold air being pumped in from outside. He pulled his jacket tighter and checked the electronic board for the next train arrival time. That's when he heard the singing. It started as a faint melody echoing through the tunnels, barely audible over the usual underground sounds. At first, David thought it might be coming from street level, maybe someone walking past the station entrance. But as the singing got louder, he realized it was definitely coming from within the tunnel system. The voice was high and clear, like a child's voice, singing what sounded like a lullaby. David couldn't make out the words, but the melody was hauntingly beautiful and somehow familiar, like something he'd heard long ago but couldn't quite place. The song seemed to be getting closer, as if whoever was singing was walking through the tunnels toward the platform. David looked around for any sign of other people, but he was still completely alone. The singing continued, growing louder and more distinct. Now he could hear that it was definitely a child's voice, maybe a little girl, singing the same melody over and over again. The electronic board showed that his train was still 8 minutes away. David considered leaving the platform and finding another road home, but curiosity got the better of him. Who would a child be in the underground tunnels at 4 in the morning? And how was the voice carrying so clearly through the maze of concrete and steel? As the minutes passed, the singing grew so loud it seemed to be coming from right next to him. David walked to the edge of the platform and peered into the dark tunnel, trying to see if anyone was walking along the tracks. The singing was so clear now that it felt like the child was standing right beside him, but there was no one there. That's when David noticed something that made his blood freeze. The frost on the platform wasn't random. It was forming patterns like tiny footprints leading from the tunnel entrance toward where he was standing. But these weren't normal footprints. They were small, delicate, the size a child would make, and they appeared to be forming in real time as the singing grew louder. David backed away from the edge, his heart hammering in his chest. The singing was so close now that he could almost feel breath on his neck, but when he spun around, there was nothing behind him but empty platform and those strange frosty patterns spreading across the concrete like an invisible person was walking right past him. The melody suddenly stopped, leaving in silence so complete that David could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears. Then, from somewhere deep in the tunnels came the sound of laughter, high childlike giggles that echoed off the walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. David's train finally arrived, the headlights cutting through the darkness as it pulled into the station. He'd never been so grateful to see those familiar red and blue Transport for London colors. The doors hissed open, and David practically threw himself into the nearest car, not caring that he looked like a madman to anyone who might be watching. But as the train pulled away from Mile End Station, David made the mistake of looking back through the window. Standing on the platform, right where he'd been waiting, was the outline of a small figure, translucent, barely visible, but definitely there. The figure raised one tiny hand and waved goodbye as the platform disappeared into the darkness behind them. David never worked another night shift after that. He transferred to the day shift within a week, taking a pay cut just to avoid being in those tunnels during the early morning hours. But sometimes, even during his daytime commutes, he'd catch himself listening for that haunting melody echoing through the underground. He did some research later and found out that in the 1940s, during the London Blitz, Mile End Station had been used as a bomb shelter. Hundreds of families would sleep on the platforms every night, trying to escape the German air raids. One night, a direct hit on the station killed dozens of people, including several children who'd been separated from their families in the chaos. David never found out which child had been singing to him that night, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone on that platform, and whatever was down there was still looking for someone to sing to. Now for our third and final story, and this one's a doozy. It comes from Tokyo, Japan, and involves a businessman named Hiroshi, who experienced something so disturbing that he moved to Osaka immediately afterward and refused to set foot in Tokyo's subway system ever again. Hiroshi worked for a tech company in Shibuya and lived in a small apartment about 40 minutes away by train. He was one of those dedicated salarymen who regularly worked 12-hour days, often staying at the office until well past midnight. This particular incident happened on a Friday night in March, around 1 in the morning, when Hiroshi was finally heading home after an especially brutal week. The Yamanote line was nearly empty at that hour, which was typical for late-night weekend travel. Hiroshi found a seat near the door and settled in for the long ride home, his briefcase balanced on his lap, his tie loosened around his neck. He was exhausted, barely keeping his eyes open as the train swayed gently through the underground tunnels. That's when he noticed the woman sitting across from him. She was probably in her 30s, wearing a simple black dress and sitting perfectly upright with her hands folded in her lap. Her long black hair hung down like a curtain, completely covering her face. At first, Hiroshi didn't think much of it. Plenty of people fell asleep on the trains, and her posture wasn't that unusual. But as the minutes passed, Hiroshi realized the woman hadn't moved at all, not even the slightest shift in position. No swaying with the motion of the train, no sign that she was breathing. She sat there like a statue, so perfectly still that it started to unnerve him. Hiroshi tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through emails to distract himself from the unsettling presence across the aisle. But every time he glanced up, the woman was still there in the exact same position, that wall of black hair hiding her face completely. The train made several stops and passengers got on and off, but the woman never moved. Even when people brushed past her or sat down next to her, she remained frozen in that same rigid posture. Hiroshi started to wonder if she was sick, maybe having some kind of medical episode. He was debating whether to say something when the woman's head began to turn. It moved slowly, mechanically, like a door opening on rusty hinges. Her face remained hidden behind her hair, but Hiroshi could tell she was turning to look directly at him. The movement was so unnatural, so deliberate, that every instinct in his body screamed at him to look away. But he couldn't. He was transfixed, watching in horror as the woman's head continued to rotate until she was facing him completely. Her hair still covered her features, but Hiroshi could sense that she was staring at him from behind that black curtain. Then she started to stand up. The movement was just as slow and mechanical as the head turn had been. She rose from her seat like she was being lifted by invisible strings, her hands never leaving her lap, her posture never changing. When she was fully upright, she began to walk toward him. Hiroshi's mouth went dry. The woman moved with an odd gliding motion, her feet barely seeming to touch the floor. As she got closer, he could smell something strange. Not perfume or shampoo, but something cold and metallic, like old coins or blood. She stopped directly in front of his seat, so close that her dress was almost touching his knees. Hiroshi could feel his heart hammering against his ribs as he stared up at her, still unable to see her face through the curtain of hair. Then, in a voice that sounded like grinding glass, she whispered, "You can see me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered in perfect Japanese but with an accent Hiroshi had never heard before. The words seemed to bypass his ears and go straight into his brain, making his skull ache. Hiroshi tried to respond, tried to say something, anything, but no sound came out. His throat had closed up completely, and his tongue felt like it was made of lead. All he could do was sit there, frozen in terror, as the woman stood over him. "You can see me," she repeated, and this time Hiroshi caught a glimpse of something pale moving behind her hair. The suggestion of a face, but wrong somehow, like features arranged in the wrong order. The train suddenly lurched as it pulled into the next station, and the woman stumbled slightly. For just a moment her hair parted, and Hiroshi saw her face clearly. It wasn't human. Where her eyes should have been were two black holes that seemed to go on forever. Her mouth was too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear, and filled with teeth that looked like broken glass. Her skin was the color of old parchment and covered in what looked like surgical scars. The doors opened with their familiar chime, and several late-night commuters got on the train. But as they passed the woman, none of them seemed to see her. They walked right past as if she wasn't there, some even brushing against her dress without reacting. The woman's impossible mouth stretched into a grin as she noticed Hiroshi watching the other passengers. "Only you," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Only you can see me. That makes you special." She reached out with one pale hand, her fingers unnaturally long and tipped with what looked like black claws. Hiroshi wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except sit there like a rabbit caught in headlights. But his body wouldn't obey him. He was completely paralyzed with fear. Just as her fingers were about to touch his face, the train pulled into Hiroshi's station. The familiar announcement played over the speakers, and somehow, hearing those normal, everyday words broke whatever spell had been holding him frozen. Hiroshi exploded into motion, jumping up from his seat and pushing past the woman toward the doors. She didn't try to stop him, just stood there with that horrible grin watching him flee. As he stumbled onto the platform, he heard her voice one last time, floating after him through the closing doors. "I'll be waiting for you, Hiroshi. Every night, every train. I'll be waiting." Hiroshi ran up the station stairs 3 at a time, not stopping until he was out on the street level. gulping down the cool night air like a drowning man. He flagged down the first taxi he saw and gave the driver his address, too shaken to trust his legs to carry him home. The next morning, Hiroshi called in sick to work. Then he called a real estate agent. Within 2 weeks, he'd found a job in Osaka and was packed and ready to move. He never told anyone why he was leaving Tokyo so suddenly, just said he needed a change of scenery. But here's what really messed with Hiroshi's head. A few months later, he was reading the news online and came across an article about the Tokyo subway system. Apparently, there had been a series of unexplained incidents on the Yamanote line. Late-night passengers were reporting encounters with a woman in black who only appeared to certain people. The article mentioned that subway officials had reviewed security footage from the trains, but the cameras never showed anything unusual. As far as the electronic eyes were concerned, these passengers had been talking to empty air, reacting to something that wasn't there. But the passengers all described the same thing: a woman with long black hair, wearing a simple black dress, who would approach them and say, "You can see me." Several people had been so traumatized by the encounter that they'd moved out of Tokyo entirely. The article ended with a quote from a Tokyo Metro spokesperson who insisted that there was no evidence of any supernatural activity on their trains, and suggested that the incidents were probably just the result of sleep deprivation and stress affecting tired commuters. Hiroshi closed his laptop and looked out the window of his new apartment in Osaka. He'd been living there for 6 months now, and he'd never once taken the subway. He walked everywhere, took buses when he had to, even bought a bicycle. Anything to avoid being trapped underground in a metal tube with whatever that thing was. But sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, Hiroshi would wonder if the woman was still down there, still riding the late-night trains, still looking for someone special who could see her. And he'd wonder what would have happened if he hadn't been able to break free from that paralysis, if those doors hadn't opened when they did. He never found out, and he never wanted to. These 3 stories share something in common beyond just taking place in subway systems. They all involve encounters with something that shouldn't exist, something that operates by rules we don't understand. Whether it's a dead man who won't stay buried, a child's ghost still looking for comfort, or something pretending to be human, these underground spaces seem to attract things that exist in the spaces between our world and whatever lies beyond. The next time you're waiting on a subway platform, especially late at night when the crowds have thinned out and you're mostly alone, remember these stories. Pay attention to the people around you. Make sure they're actually breathing. Make sure they cast shadows under the fluorescent lights. And if someone starts staring at you with hollow, lifeless eyes, or if you hear a child singing in the tunnels, or if a woman in black tells you that you can see her, maybe consider taking a taxi home instead. So there you have it, 3 stories that'll make you think twice about your daily commute. Marcus with his ghostly stalker in New York, David and his singing phantom child in London, and Hiroshi facing something that shouldn't exist on the Tokyo rails. Each of these people thought they were just taking a normal train ride home, but they ended up in situations that changed their lives forever. What gets me about these stories is how ordinary they all started. Just regular people, tired after long days, doing something millions of us do every single day, riding the subway. But down there in those tunnels, in those spaces between the world above and whatever lies beneath, normal rules don't seem to apply. I don't know what it is about subway systems that attracts these kinds of experiences. Maybe it's because they're liminal spaces, places of transition where people are neither here nor there, just passing through. Or maybe it's because they're built on top of so much history, so many layers of human experience buried beneath the concrete and steel. Whatever the reason, these stories remind us that the world is stranger and more dangerous than we usually like to admit. The next time you're standing on a platform late at night, pay attention to who's around you. Trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, if someone's staring too long or moving too strangely, don't ignore it. If you've got your own subway horror story, drop it in the comments below. And if this video gave you chills, make sure to hit that subscribe button because I've got plenty more true horror stories coming your way.